This revenge story contains intense acts of retribution that may be excessive and could be disturbing to some viewers.
The moment I saw Thomas Morgan's dead body on the evening news, I knew Jill had gone too far. The mangled taxi wreck flashed across the screen, and my stomach churned as I remembered how this all started, with a single text message that destroyed our marriage. 3 months earlier, I never thought I'd become the kind of husband who spies on his wife. But that morning, as Jill stepped into the shower, her phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." The sender's name made my blood run cold. Thomas Morgan. My hands trembled as I scrolled through their messages, each word a dagger to my heart. The casual flirting, the intimate details, the plans they'd made, right under my nose. But what I didn't know then was that Jill wasn't Thomas's only victim. He had a pattern, a sick game he played with multiple women's lives. And now, as I watched the news report of his accident, I couldn't help but wonder, had my discovery set in motion a chain of events that would destroy us all? The hum of the television filled our living room as Jill walked in, her face pale as she saw the wreckage on screen. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes held something I'd never seen before. A cold, calculated satisfaction that sent chills down my spine. What had she done? And more importantly, what would happen to us now? What terrified me most wasn't just what had happened to Thomas. It was how my wife had transformed from a betrayed spouse into someone I no longer recognized. Someone capable of things I never thought possible. I never considered myself the type to delve into my wife's private affairs, to become the kind of guy who rifles through her phone like some jealous teenager. But lately, a nagging unease had settled into my gut, a cold knot that wouldn't unravel. Jill, my Jill, was acting different. It wasn't one big, glaring red flag, but a series of subtle changes, like the slow leak of a faucet, each drop seemingly insignificant on its own, but eventually filling the sink to overflowing. She'd always been glued to her phone. That's a given in this day and age. But now it felt like she was hiding something, constantly glancing around as she typed, a nervous energy radiating off of her. Her smiles were reserved for the screen, not for me. Each time I'd enter a room, the screen would snap off or quickly switch to something benign, a news app, a recipe, whatever. "Work stuff," she'd say, her tone dismissive, her eyes darting away from mine, that tight little smile plastered on her face, the kind that never reached her eyes. It was like a carefully constructed mask, and I was left wondering what she was trying to hide. The work meetings were becoming increasingly frequent, always at some obscure location on the other side of town, and often stretching late into the night. The excuses seemed rushed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding me, pulling away piece by piece. Then there were the girls' nights out, which were never really girls' nights. She'd barely mention them until the last minute and come home smelling different, the perfume she wore that I didn't recognize. The casual way she said it, like it was just another Tuesday night. The shift in her. It felt like I was looking at a stranger. The woman I loved was slowly disappearing right in front of me. It felt like a slow burn, and I was starting to get burned. One evening, the tension became unbearable, and I knew I had to talk to someone. I met Leo at O'Malley's, our usual haunt. A dim dive bar with sticky tables and the smell of stale beer hanging in the air, thick as a blanket. The neon sign outside buzzed like an angry insect. "I think Jill's cheating on me," I blurted out, the words rushing out, my voice sounding rough around the edges, like gravel. My face was hot and my body was tense. I knew I was making myself look like a fool, but I had to say it, to get it out into the air. Leo, ever the pragmatist, leaned back in his chair, the low light casting long shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip of his beer, the silence stretching out like a tight wire about to snap. "If you are wrong, you'll feel like a complete dumbass, Mike," he said, his voice calm and even. "But if you are right, you'll want to know. No doubt about it. Trust me." He was always so level-headed about things. It was the opposite of how I felt. His words didn't offer much comfort, but there was truth to them. A cold, hard dose of reality. The idea of snooping felt like a betrayal of trust, but I was teetering on the edge, desperate for answers. I had to know. I couldn't live in this limbo any longer. I had to confirm it myself. The next morning, my heart pounded in my chest as I waited for Jill to step into the shower. I waited for the water to run, creating the white noise. I grabbed her phone. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, but I managed to type in her password. It was the one we'd shared for years, the password to a shared life, now feeling like a secret code. The lock screen flicked open. I was in. My hands were so clammy, I could barely see the words. I went straight to her messages, and there they were, a string of back and forth with a guy named Thomas Morgan. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through them, each message a punch in the gut. They started out innocuous enough, the casual banter of two people getting to know each other, but they quickly devolved into flirting, then something far more intimate. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one message said, followed by a string of suggestive emojis. "You make me feel like no one else can." Read another. It was sickening. The words themselves, reading them on her phone, it was different from just imagining it. It was a betrayal in black and white. I felt the blood drain from my face. A wave of nausea washed over me as the truth settled in, bitter and ugly. I kept reading, each word a brand on my soul. It was all there, the lies, the deceit, the betrayal. She'd been playing me like a fiddle, and it hurt like hell. I felt like my entire world was collapsing, like everything I thought I knew was nothing but a fabrication. I closed my eyes for a moment, the blackness bringing no relief. I felt dizzy, like I was about to pass out. The messages were a hammer blow to my soul. I copied some of the messages onto a new doc and emailed them to myself. I knew I couldn't show this to Jill yet. I had to get my bearings. I met Leo that night, showed him the messages. He looked them over, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. "Damn it," he said, shaking his head. "Damn it, Mike. I am so sorry." He was silent for a moment, his face unreadable. This is bad. This is a real problem. "What do I do?" I asked again. My voice was just a whisper, thick with emotion. I felt defeated. "We get proof," he said, the calmness in his tone betraying the anger bubbling underneath. "We need to be absolutely sure. No doubt at all." His eyes met mine, and he was serious. "We need to make sure you are not crazy, Mike." So, we did it. We set up a hidden camera, camouflaged inside a hollowed-out book on our living room shelf. It felt wrong and invasive, like a step too far. But I couldn't stop myself. It was like I was watching myself in a movie I didn't want to be in. A few days crawled by, each one an eternity. The tension in our apartment thick enough to cut with a knife. I barely spoke to Jill, and she barely spoke to me. The air between us was charged with suspicion and unspoken accusations. We were walking on eggshells, each of us waiting for the other to crack. The small talk felt fake and forced, a mockery of the intimacy we once shared. I couldn't look at her without feeling a mix of anger and hurt, a bitter taste that lingered on my tongue. The quiet was a deafening roar. The night we finally decided to watch the footage, I was a nervous wreck. I met Leo at his place. my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold my coffee cup. My stomach felt like it was filled with lead. Leo, on the other hand, was calm as always. He loaded the video on his laptop, and we settled onto his couch, the screen glowing in the dim light. We didn't say a word. It felt like watching a terrible movie, the kind you can't tear your eyes away from, even though you know it will break you into a million pieces. There she was, Jill, in our living room, laughing, her head tilted toward some guy on my couch, touching his arm. Thomas Morgan. I didn't know what he looked like until I saw him in the video. His arm was around her waist, his hand moving up and down her back. Then he kissed her, and my whole world seemed to tilt off its axis. It wasn't just a peck on the cheek. It was a long, lingering kiss, the kind you share with someone you are in love with. The kind of kiss she used to give me before all of this. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just the act itself, the physical infidelity. It was the ease with which she was doing it. In my home, on my couch, with the man I was now learning was named Thomas. It was the casualness of it all, like this was normal behavior. I confronted her that very night. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I just held up my phone, the screen showing the incriminating footage. "Explain this, Jill," I said, my voice low and menacing, every word dripping with cold fury. My heart was pounding against my ribs, and I had to fight to keep myself from breaking down right there and then. Her face went white, her eyes widening like a deer caught in headlights. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling, attempting to play the innocent, pretending she didn't know what was going on. "Don't play games, Jill," I said, my voice getting louder. "You know damn well what that is." I felt my hands shaking. She started to stammer, her hands flying up to her face. "It's not what you think," she insisted, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were wide and desperate. "Really? Then what is it? Because it looks like you are kissing another guy on my couch." "On our couch, Jill. I watched it. I have the video. I have proof." I felt my body shake as I played the video on the television. Her face went white as a sheet as she watched herself, her jaw clenching. Okay, she conceded, her voice trembling. "So maybe it happened once or twice, but it didn't mean anything." She looked like she was about to cry. "So cheating doesn't mean anything now? Is that your story?" I said, the sarcasm dripping from every word. My hands were balled up into fists. "What else have you got? I mean, while we are at it." The thing that really floored me was what I found out next. Thanks to some digging, some internet sleuthing from Leo, we uncovered a disturbing pattern. It wasn't just me, not even close. Thomas wasn't seeing just Jill. He was seeing a bunch of women, all of them believing they were the only ones. We found profiles for Sarah, Jessica, and Lisa, all of them with photos of them and Thomas. It was a pattern, a twisted game of deception. The guy was a serial cheater, a walking, talking cliché. I showed Jill the pictures of the other women, watched as her face contorted in shock, anger, and then a strange sort of grief. "He told me I was special," she said, her voice trembling, a tear sliding down her cheek. "He looked me in the eyes and lied." Her voice grew in intensity. "He looked at me and he lied." A part of me, a small, foolish part of me, felt a flicker of sympathy. She had been betrayed just like me, a victim of the same manipulative lie. But I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. Not yet, anyway. Not after what she'd done to me, and to our marriage. The anger bubbled up, hot and intense. "Well, you know how that feels, right, Jill?" I said, the bitterness raw in my voice. "You are not so special either." He was playing all of us. All of us were a joke to him. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. We were just two people, caught in a web of lies. The conversation went on for hours like this, a back and forth of blame, lies, and hurt. We rehashed all the moments I felt she lied to me, every excuse she'd given, every late night, every time I was made to look like a fool. I wanted her to feel the hurt I felt. That night, something changed in Jill. She went from betrayed wife to a woman with a thirst for revenge, a woman who wanted to watch the world burn. It was more than just anger. It was a cold, calculated fury, a desire to make Thomas suffer just as much, if not more than she had. Jill's transformation was unsettling. She went from a quiet, seemingly submissive woman to a force of nature. She was like a coiled snake, ready to strike, her eyes burning with a dangerous glint. The hurt that had been in her eyes was now replaced with rage. It was like she had tapped into something dark and powerful, something that scared me just a little. She wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. She wasted no time. She reached out to Sarah, Jessica, and Lisa, revealing Thomas's lies and exposing his web of deception. The text chains were long, full of bitterness and accusations. The phone calls were raw and emotional, as all of Thomas's lies were revealed to the women. She didn't hold back, sparing no detail, leaving no stone unturned in her quest to destroy him. The fallout was instant and brutal. Thomas's social media accounts were bombarded with angry posts and scathing comments. His picture was plastered everywhere, accompanied by snake emojis and accusations of infidelity. He became a public enemy number one. His reputation at work crumbled. His colleagues started giving him wide berth, and his boss gave him a final warning. The world was turning against him. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. I observed all of this with a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. The sense of justice was there, of course, but there was also a sense of dread, a feeling that things were spiraling out of control. The fire was burning hot, and there was no knowing just how much it would consume. The satisfaction was sweet, but it was also tinged with the fear of what was coming. But Jill wasn't done with Thomas yet. No, she wanted to make him pay for humiliating her, for lying to her, for making her feel like a fool. Her anger was a cold, simmering thing, not a fiery outburst. I had a strange sense of pride in her and disgust for her at the same time. It was a twisted feeling that I didn't understand. She wanted to inflict the same pain that she felt, but multiplied by 10. Her revenge wasn't just about exposing his lies. It was about destroying his life. One evening, she told me she was going out, but I knew where she was going. I didn't need to ask her. I just felt it in my gut. She had a determined look in her eyes, a look that sent shivers down my spine. "Be careful," was all I could muster, my voice tight and hesitant. The next day, the news broke that Thomas had been injured at the gym. Apparently, a weight machine had malfunctioned, and he'd broken his arm badly. A clean break that would keep him out of action for weeks. The word malfunctioned stuck in my mind. It felt too convenient, like a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. My gut told me it wasn't just an accident. I knew that deep down, I knew Jill was somehow involved, but I didn't want to know the details. Jill returned home that night, her face devoid of emotion, like she'd gone through something terrible, but was unable to feel it. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were cold, like ice. "He deserved it," she said, her voice flat and mechanical, like she was reading a line from a script. She wouldn't look at me, instead, choosing to stare blankly at the wall. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know that woman anymore. I didn't press her for details. I didn't want to know exactly what she had done at the gym. I knew she'd been there. I knew she wanted Thomas to feel pain. I could fill in the rest. My stomach churned with the knowledge I was willingly suppressing. The image of Jill standing in the gym, sabotaging the machine, played over and over in my mind. It was a terrifying thought, and I couldn't shake it. I knew that what was coming next was going to be worse. Thomas's life started to unravel faster after that. His broken arm meant he couldn't drive. He was now forced to rely on taxis and ride shares to get around. His ex-girlfriends were spreading rumors about him like wildfire, making his life a living hell. He was a social pariah, the butt of every joke, the target of every scornful glance. His life was in shambles. He was losing everything. His job, his friends, his dignity. He was radioactive, and everyone was staying far away. He was left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. I saw him once, a few weeks later, walking down the street. His arm was in a sling, his head was bowed, and he looked like he'd aged 20 years in just a few months. He seemed defeated. He was a shadow of the man he once was. I felt a strange twinge of something, a mix of satisfaction and something that almost resembled pity, but it was fleeting, replaced by the feeling that we were just getting started and things were about to get worse for all of us. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, Leo called, his voice grave, the kind of tone that makes your blood run cold. "You are not going to believe this," he said, the words trembling slightly. "Thomas is dead, Mike." I felt my body grow cold, my stomach dropping to the floor, my breath hitched in my chest, a wave of shock and disbelief washing over me. I didn't know what to say. I just repeated, "What? What?" According to the news, Thomas had been in a taxi on his way to a job interview when the taxi driver had lost control, swerved to avoid a pedestrian, and crashed head-on into a tree. The details were gruesome. The image of the mangled taxi flashing across the screen. The police ruled it an accident, just a tragic, senseless accident. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too convenient, too sudden, too final. I felt like I was stuck in a terrible nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. The news channels were all playing the same footage. The crumpled taxi, the ambulance sirens, the police tape blocking off the area. It was all surreal, like I was watching a movie instead of reality. I saw the paramedics placing the body into a body bag, and I felt the color drain from my face. They didn't show his face, and I was grateful. I didn't want to see it. All I could see was the image of Jill's cold eyes the night she came home from the gym. Thomas's name popped up on the bottom of the screen, and it hit me hard. I never even met the guy, but he was now a permanent fixture in my life, an anchor pulling me down to the bottom. Jill's reaction was the opposite of what I'd anticipated. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel vindicated. She was utterly destroyed, a broken shell of a woman, consumed by guilt. She was pacing the apartment, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with panic and fear. "This is my fault, Mike," she kept saying, her voice hoarse and trembling. If I hadn't heard him, he wouldn't have been in that taxi. He wouldn't be dead. She looked at me, her eyes filled with pain. It was the first time I had seen any real emotion from her since her revenge began. She started seeing a therapist, going to appointments, but it didn't seem to help. The guilt was a relentless monster, chewing her up from the inside out. She'd stopped sleeping and eating. Her eyes were perpetually bloodshot. She was reliving that night in the gym over and over, a cycle of guilt and self-blame that she couldn't break free from. She was a ghost in our apartment. I watched her, feeling lost and confused. Her pain was a distorted mirror of my own inner turmoil. I knew her actions were driven by anger and hurt, but I also knew that her revenge had set off a chain of events that had ended in tragedy. I stood by. I watched her take the action, and I'd done nothing. I'd even encouraged her a bit. I'd never felt more of a monster. I had no idea what to do anymore. The hum in my chest was now a constant, dull roar. The police report said it was just a simple traffic accident. The taxi driver said he'd swerved to avoid a pedestrian, but there were no witnesses to back up his story. I kept replaying Jill's words in my mind. If I hadn't heard him, he wouldn't have been that taxi. And my blood went cold. Was it a confession? Was she admitting to something I didn't know? It didn't seem possible. And yet, I started looking for connections, digging around, trying to see if there was any way that the taxi accident was related to Jill's actions. It was a long shot, but I had to know. I had to see if my suspicions were valid. I reviewed the surveillance footage near the gym, and I went through traffic cameras. I spent hours online, trying to piece things together, but I found nothing. It was just a coincidence, just a tragic accident. But the feeling that it was somehow connected to what we had done wouldn't leave me alone. The guilt was eating me alive. Had I caused all of this? If I hadn't told Leo about Jill's actions, would things have turned out differently? If I hadn't installed that camera, would Thomas still be alive? I was spiraling, my mind full of questions I knew I could never answer. I had taken the first step down that road of revenge, and now we were all lost in a maze of despair. Jill's mental state spiraled rapidly downward, each day bringing her further into the depths of despair. She was haunted by nightmares, her sleep constantly interrupted by vivid images of Thomas, his broken arm twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring accusingly at her. She was living in a constant state of fear, her reality becoming more and more distorted. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing her. She couldn't escape the ghost of her actions. She stopped eating altogether, her skin becoming pale and translucent, like she was fading away. Her body became fragile, like she could break at any moment. She'd go for days without speaking, her gaze distant, like she was looking at some invisible world. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by a nightmarish cycle of hallucinations and terror. She'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night, her body rigid and shaking, her eyes wide with a fear that was palpable. "He's here, Mike," she'd whisper, her voice trembling, clinging to me like I was her lifeline. "He's right here in the room, looking at me. He's watching everything." She'd point at the dark corners of the bedroom, her hand shaking uncontrollably, convinced that Thomas's ghost was present. I tried everything to comfort her, to reassure her that it was all in her head. I'd hold her tight, whispering soothing words, telling her it was just a nightmare. But she couldn't be consoled. The horror in her eyes was real, her terror all-consuming. She was beyond my ability to help. She was trapped in her own mind, a prisoner of her guilt and her fear. One night, it reached a critical point. She woke up screaming, her body contorted, her eyes filled with an otherworldly terror. She was convinced that Thomas was standing at the foot of our bed, his broken arm a gnarled, grotesque shadow. "He's right there, Mike," she cried, her voice cracking, her nails digging into my arm. "Can't you see him? He's right there." I looked, and all I could see was the darkness. But I knew in that moment, she wasn't just grieving. She wasn't just afraid. She was in the middle of a full-blown breakdown, her mind fracturing before my very eyes. I tried to reason with her, to tell her it was a hallucination, but she didn't hear me. She was lost in her own private hell. I knew I was about to lose her. I spent the entire night trying to calm her, holding her, watching as she slipped further and further away from reality. It was like trying to hold on to a ghost, trying to stop the inevitable. I could see in her eyes that she was gone. She was a different person, someone who had been replaced by a shell. I called her therapist, who came immediately, and after a long consultation, it became clear that she needed professional help. They recommended she be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, that it was the only way to get her the treatment she so desperately needed. It was either that, or she would hurt herself. The hospital was a place of last resort. I didn't want to see her go, but I knew it was the only thing to do. The doctor talked about medication, therapy, and a long road to recovery. But I didn't hear any of it. I was just numb. The next month was a surreal blur, a constant stream of visiting hours, doctor's appointments, and silent drives to the hospital. I drove her there myself, the car filled with a heavy silence punctuated by her soft sobbing. She looked so small and frail in the passenger seat, her eyes hollow and empty. It was like I was driving her to her execution. The hospital was sterile and cold, the hallways echoing with the muted sounds of despair. The doctors diagnosed her with severe depression and PTSD, but I knew it was more than that. It was guilt. It was the weight of Thomas's death, a burden she couldn't bear. She was trapped in her own mind, reliving everything that had happened, her actions playing over and over in an endless loop. She was a broken woman, and I didn't know if she would ever be whole again. I watched as she was taken away, the metal door closing behind her. It felt like losing her for good. I went to visit her every day. The hospital was a bleak place, the walls painted a depressing shade of beige. I'd sit by her bedside, trying to talk to her, but it was like talking to a ghost. She barely spoke, her eyes distant and vacant, like she was seeing something I couldn't. It was like talking to a stranger. The woman I loved had disappeared, leaving nothing but a shadow in her place. She was lost, and I felt helpless, powerless to bring her back. The hum in my chest was now a constant throbbing pain, a reminder of all the choices we had made and how they had led to this. I felt responsible for her, but I knew that nothing I could say or do would change what had happened. We were both broken, trapped in a prison of our own making,